Okay, so we have on the stage four Savas, and our next speaker once apparently won a competitive eating competition. Is that true?
Yeah, it is true.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And today he's here to talk about temporal modal logic. Please welcome Foy Savas.
Thank you. All right, today's topic is temporal modal logic. And first off, there's this. Have you guys seen this? Okay, so this is, just for clarity, this is, you cannot optically zoom into a chip like this, but this is Apple silicon, and it's a bit of a composite of videos, and it's just amazing. If you haven't seen this, it's just like, it keeps on zooming in, and you're like, okay, when does it stop? And, you know, to make this video happen, they had to actually cut through layers or, you know, composite videos, and the presentation I'm about to give you does a bit of that too. So I want you to just hang on for the ride, but, you know, get the big picture. And I mean, look at this thing. You think it's done, and then it just keeps going. And so now I have to ask, how would you build this? How would you build that thing, okay? And for clarity, the task we're talking about is you need to coordinate tens of billions of transistors with no bugs. And, you know, this is a one-shot coordination problem. And no bugs is serious because, you know, one time there was an Intel Pentium floating point division bug, and 1 out of 9 billion divisions had like a little bit of noise in it. That cost Intel $475 million. They had to do a recall, okay? So no bugs is a real thing. And I don't know how I could ever do that because I can't even ship a few hundred lines of React code without shipping a bug. So now you look at this thing, which is tens of billions of transistors. That's like a tiny world. Well, here's the big idea. Instead of instructions, let's give them laws. And, well, okay, well, maybe you think that just sounds like programming with extra steps. But what if I told you that actually since the beginning of computer science, since the first actual calculators, there's been this dichotomy, that computer science has been about two parallel pursuits. One, on one side, command, and the other side, govern. And you might ask, well, then how do we code laws? And, well, you're in luck because today is the story of how we figured out how to code laws, how temporal logic saved hardware development, and why temporal logic may save computing once again. And today is the story of box and diamond. So we're going to hack time a little bit, and I hope you're ready to do this. We're going to go back in time, talking about temporal logic. Let's go back to ancient Athens. This is Theophrastus. Theophrastus says he's not here. Okay, we're going off to the island of Lesbos. Great. Look, clams have eyes. Okay. Just so you guys know, I have been using AI slop to generate these images. I asked the AI to produce anatomically correct mollusk eyes, but it made them blue. They don't actually look like that, but they are blue. And this is Aristotle, and how to describe who Aristotle was. Well, Aristotle was a guy who really loved writing stuff down. And which is funny because 2 generations earlier we had Socrates who said writing makes you dumb. And of course, we'd know that because his student, Plato, wrote that down. And but Aristotle was the son of a Macedonian court doctor. He didn't want to become a doctor, and so his family said, okay, go off and study with Plato instead. And he was just ridiculously wealthy. He was a ridiculously wealthy kid. He could buy as many books as he wanted, and it was a bit of an obsession, and even for Plato, it was too much. But what matters to us is that, well, Aristotle becomes the ancient world's one-man Wikipedia. And today, you know, we saw him documenting animals, which explains the clam thing. And he had such an overflow of things he wanted to write down. He would even write down questions. For instance, why are travelers more likely to get sick drinking foreign water than they are when they're eating foreign food? It's a pretty good question. Today, we're going to ask him about logic. Aristotle tells us he was the first to consider logic. Well, that's a pretty bold claim, Aristotle, don't you think? Because was it not the Pythagoreans hundreds of years ago who used proof? Well, didn't Socrates going around bugging people about truth? And didn't your own teacher Plato talk about ideal forms? But yet, But yet, Aristotle might argue, it was the Pythagoreans that threw Hippasus off a ship. Why? Because he proved that their sacred rational numbers weren't always sacred, that the square root of 2 was irrational. And wasn't it Socrates, he was so bad at describing the virtue of reason. He described it as a demon, so unconvincingly that they forced him to drink hemlock. And, well, what about Plato? Diogenes bested him with a plucked chicken, over the definition of what is man. But what Aristotle might really succinctly tell us is that, well, logi are actually just words. And so what he had to do was he had to survey all the ways that people were arguing with each other. Logic, as we think of it today, did not exist. And what he found was that there was a subset of logic, a subset called apophantic logic. And he made that word up. It means from appearance, but the basic idea is that logical arguments that from appearance alone can be decided whether they're valid or not. And this is cool because it creates this separation of concerns for logic. We can all of a sudden agree on the reasoning process without agreeing to the facts themselves. And his largely didactic use case is the syllogism. In goes a major premise, a minor premise, and out comes a conclusion. You've probably seen this before in the canonical example of all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. But of course, here's a fishy example. All organisms have eyes. Clams are organisms, therefore all clams have eyes. Now, we might look at this form and say, yes, this is true, but we might, as contemporaries, say that not all organisms have eyes. In fact, bacteria exist, which would also explain why water gets you sick. But that kind of thing, Aristotle didn't know. What is this? He's got a mock net. Very Steve Jobs. One more thing, modal logic. Okay, so Aristotle also came up with this concept of modal logic. And modal logic, what is it? It's apophantic logic about the necessary and the possible. Two very interesting words. And Aristotle tried to write some stuff down about this, but was very confused. He recognized it, but he simply could not systematize it. Well, 2 down. We got modal logic. We got logic down. We got modal, temporal. And I'd like to finish this up quickly, but unfortunately, Aristotle was a very hard act to follow. Theophrastus, who's aged a bit since we last saw him, he became the father of botany, and he also did some logic stuff. Modus tollens. He was basically like a mini Aristotle, but again, very hard to follow up. Progress on logic was slow. Anyone who tried to even grok modal logic was hitting a wall. Stoic logicians tried to add time to it, but they started arguing about whether the present should be considered part of the future or not. The medieval world continued to revere Aristotle's logic for a long time. They would sing songs just to kind of remember the various forms of syllogism. But again, progress was slow. It wasn't like there was absolutely no progress. In the medieval world, there was some, like this over here. There was progress on contingent beings, like if you're arguing about unicorns or Pegasus or Chimera, how should you figure that out? Well, William of Ockham figured that out, and he wrote something here, and I don't feel like reading it. It was these logicians were thus lampooned by Voltaire, who described them as debating the legality of eating non-existent griffins. And in fact, Voltaire wrote another book about our next hero, entitled The Optimist. And so let's take a look at that. This guy, Leibniz, he's a genius. He's a polymath, and in his time, he was the youngest person to receive a law degree. You might know him from calculus, but actually his profession was as a legal scholar. And he thought of law as sophistry with a thin veneer of logic, but only as artifice. And Leibniz had a habit. He had a habit of seeing the ideal in things, so it didn't let him get him down. And let me give you an example of something else that he saw the ideal in. At one point, Leibniz got fascinated with Chinese characters. And, well, he didn't actually end up learning Chinese because, that's a big, messy language. But what he did get excited about was the possibility of ideographs. Wow, if only we could make an ideograph for absolutely every single thing. Well, then we could have this thing called the Characteristica Universalis, an ideograph for everything. And then he wondered, well, could I make a machine that would reason over all these ideographs? Well, one generation earlier, we're fortunate enough to have this guy over here, Pascal. And Pascal's father was a tax accountant. And as a tax accountant, he tasked his son with crunching numbers. But Pascal hated it. He hated it so much. And, from Pascal's laziness as a virtue, we got the world's first calculator, the Pascaline. But Pascal became very negative about his own work. He got a patent from the King of France. He started selling it, but he got a little bit depressed about it. And maybe it's because he was the first person to face integer overflow. And he wrote things like, nothing is purely true, and nothing is true. He threw away his machine. But Leibniz saw something greater. Leibniz said, if you can do A plus B equals C, why can't you do A and B imply C? And at the same time, he was thinking about possible and necessary, and he said, well, you know, with all these legal documents that I work with, may and must, there's something similar about them. And so he said, wow, what if we could actually figure out legal arguments by throwing them into something like a calculator? Then we could just say, let us calculate. And without further ado, see who's right. And Leibniz wasn't all talk. He actually built stuff. He was a maker. This is his stepped reckoner, and it does multiplication. So it one-upped Pascal. And he wanted to do, obviously, much, much more on it. But, Leibniz didn't get to it. And on the way, he vaporwared binary encoding because he wanted to be able to do anything on this machine. And he also gave us the concept of functions. So functional programming, it comes from Leibniz. And what was his ultimate hope? He wanted to produce a book. And that book was a book that would define the fundamental laws of jurisprudence. That also never happened. But now we just saw that there were actually two parallel pursuits of computer science, and they started even just with the basic calculator. On one side we have command, on the other side we have govern. And this command govern dynamic, you might think deterministic on one side, non-deterministic on the other. I think that's related, but not exactly it. Procedural on one side, functional on the other. No, that's not exactly it, but something. I've seen a contemporary philosopher, William Rappaport, and he describes these two historical figures in just about the same way, and says on one side sits numerical calculation, on the other side sits mathematical proof. I would say yes, that's it. But I feel that it sells us short, that mathematics is actually a special case of well-governed something. And I'm not going to fill in that something, I'll leave that to you, but it's a special case. And in fact, if anything, this command versus governed dynamic is the application of imperative versus logical, if we think about programming paradigms. Anyway, this left a fork in the road. And on one side, we know the history very well. We know Pascal, we know Babbage, we know Boole, we know Turing. But Leibniz, who followed up Leibniz? There was a long pause. Until this guy, Frege. And Frege said Leibniz's ideas were so gigantic that any attempt to realize them just could not go beyond the bare preliminaries. But even if this worthy goal cannot be reached in one leap, we need not despair of a slow, step-by-step approximation. And in 1879, Frege had a big idea. And this is the same year the light bulb came out, so we'll give him a light bulb. And his idea was concept script. It's effectively the first programming language. It's got variables, it's got negation, it's got conjugation, it's got disjunction, it's got loops, it has functions, it's got it all. But it looks like this. They didn't have computers, it's just a pen and paper thing, and it's got various different scripts, and it's a mess. But what's really cool about it is it's the first logic with quantifiers over variables. A lot of people think of it as a first-order logic, but it's actually a second-order logic. It's a little subtlety, but anyway, it's got this thing called the universal for all. It'll look over all the examples and tell you whether it's still true, and it'll look, or it could look for existence. Is there one example that's true? And Frege's intended first use case, the foundations of mathematics. After all, he was a mathematics professor. So he started publishing some works, and unfortunately, a young man by the name of Russell sent Frege a letter detailing a self-referential paradox. You guys probably know this paradox. You've probably seen it before. And this devastated Frege. But Russell himself said, I'll crack at it. And along with his friend Whitehead, they put out a work called the Principia. It's a huge work. It's enormous. But there was one guy who actually read it cover to cover. His name is Gödel. And here's a comparison between Principia and Gödel's critique, which is just really tiny. And the thing that Gödel showed at the end of this was that, hey, all this work that Russell put in, well, actually, these systems that you're trying to build are fundamentally undecidable. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'm sure a bunch of you already know this. If not, and even if so, I recommend picking up this book called Frege to Gödel. But where I do want to take this is the next thing that Gödel did. The next thing that Gödel did was, wow, he produced these great proofs showing us what is and isn't possible from within these logic systems. These were proofs about possibility. And so Gödel went deep. He dove deeper into the formalism of expressing possibility. Lucky for him, another guy named C.I. Lewis had just produced a book on symbolic logic. And C.I. Lewis had surveyed all of modal logics. And guess what he found? He found that actually there wasn't just one modal logic. There were many of them. So maybe that explains why we're all so confused. So these words possible and necessary, it's not always that. Like maybe in deontic logic, it's possible, it's permissible and obligatory, or it's what's believable and believed. But what he did find was that despite these differences, he could create different axiomatic structures for all of them, and that they could all share the same symbols for necessity and possibility, which he gave as box and diamond. So these common glyphs now come with this like Kino duality, which is box P equals not diamond, not P. And you might have seen that kind of duality elsewhere, but it's very cool. And Gödel showed us that, now Gödel, looking at all this stuff, starts to ask the question, okay, that's cool, but can I make it more mathy? And what he did was he showed that he could actually take what was modal logic and take a constructive, intuitionistic approach and interpret box as not P. And this eventually became the thing called provability logic. You guys don't need to know all of this, but we are making progress. We've got axiomatic deduction, but we really also don't know exactly what this box and diamond really mean. In came this guy, Saul Kripke. And Saul Kripke published a paper called Semantical Considerations of Modal Logic. And this new concept called possible world semantics. And it's actually pretty simple. The idea is that there are worlds. Here we have little dots for worlds. And there are propositions in those worlds. And they can be true or not true. Here we see in world 1 and 3, P is true, but in world 2, it's not true. And the thing that he adds are this idea that there's an accessibility relationship between these worlds, and that they're arrows. And box and diamond can now be interpreted as a for all or exists over this accessibility relationship. And this is a key insight. All of a sudden, we go from modal logic being this extraordinarily confusing thing to being able to step beyond its axiomatic deduction and now understand that modal logic is actually the logic of paths in graphs. Okay, well, what about time? Did anybody figure that out? Well, there was a guy named Arthur Pryor, and he came up with this thing. And he realized that, well, sometimes you might be talking about what happens always in the future or eventually in the future, but you also might be talking about that backward looking. He wrote down extensive work, and I just want to make you aware of that. So, yeah, we do have some concept of temporal. But this is all still theoretical and pie in the sky, and like, who's ever going to use this? In the late 70s, Lamport came up with the idea of safety and liveness. These are two interesting properties that you say, well, hey, I might want to describe properties of a program, and I'm going to describe them in a specific way. But still, people were thinking, okay, well, I have to produce a proof for the program? How am I going to do this? Thankfully, in the same year, Amir Punelli came up with the concept of linear temporal logic, and otherwise known as LTL. And this expresses properties over linear time. And his key insight was, hey, let's take the tense logic from Arthur Pryor, but let's only look forward-looking. If we only do forward-looking, well, then all of a sudden it becomes a decidable logic, and now we can really talk about things. And if we take that tense logic, well, it just so happens that G is box and F is diamond. Okay, so there was another guy who, around the same time, Ed Clark, he came up with another thing called computational tree logic. And this now allows us to express things over branching time. And the last one had that word linear time. You're probably wondering what that means. Well, there are things that are expressible in CTL but not in LTL. So let me give you a quick example. Here's a statement. You don't need to fully understand it. But look at just the verbal articulation of this. No matter your past, there's always a path to heaven. This is something you can say in CTL, but you can't say it in LTL because you can't do this kind of universal possible path redemption in LTL. In fact, there are also statements that you can say in LTL, but you can't say in CTL. So what people found was that it would be great if we could just combine these two. And later on, we did find ways to combine these two. There's a thing known as a CTL star and another thing called the modal mu calculus. But I don't want to get too far into that. What I want to say is that this was actually the birth of model checking. Because all of a sudden now we could actually code. We could write down specs. And those specs would either be written in LTL or CTL, and we would produce, we'd have a model, look at those specs, and then comprehensively basically fuzz it and say, is there a counterexample that works against these specs? But this stayed fairly academic actually for a little bit of time. It was only used to look at abstract protocols. Enter a brilliant but stubborn PhD student who was butting heads with his PhD advisor over his thesis. So Bud Mishra was basically his advisor just would not deal with him anymore. But Ed Clark was smart enough to reach out to him and said, hey, I will be your new advisor. But all you have to do is you have to use model checking for something else than protocols. You do that, and then I'll let you write your thesis about anything you want. And this was, well that was pure motivation. So Bud picked up a book, the Meade-Conway stick diagram book, which back then, this is how chips were designed, the little different colors to describe the layers of where everything goes. And he found a canonical example of a FIFO queue, created a model for it, wrote some specs in CTL, and out came a counterexample. This was the first time a hardware bug was ever found by this means, and the birth of hardware verification. Why? He said he did it in just a couple nights of work because he wanted to write his thesis on whatever he wanted. But a great paper, Automatic Verification of Sequential Circuits Using Temporal Logic. Birth of hardware verification. Bud showed this to Ivan Sutherland, who was a VSLI core contributor. But Sutherland thought, yeah, there's no way hardware engineers are going to learn temporal logic. Absolutely no way. Well, within a few years, they did start learning it, but market adoption did also take a little bit of time too. The Intel bug is viewed as a turning point, a point after which hardware is no longer shipped without doing a good amount of hardware verification. And so here's a tweet today from a fellow over at Grok, that's Grok with a Q, talking about how chip verification engineers use a special property specification assertion sublanguage called System Verilog, which is an immensely successful application of LTL logic that's used to formally verify computer chips. For that, we can thank Amir Punelli and all those other people you just learned about. So, yeah. LFG, temporal logic rules, right? But sitting here, looking at all you guys, you're probably cracked coders. You're probably thinking LFC. So let's fuzz and code. And I could teach you LTL, CTL, modal mu calculus, any one of these things. But you know what? They all have this notorious notion of being really hard. So actually, all of this preamble was a little bit good because Bud and I have been working on a new temporal logic system built for a new use case where we call verifiable systems, and it's called modality. I'd like you to check it out. It's not exactly fully shipped yet, but join the Discord or something like that. And it's easy to learn. Why do I know it's easy to learn? Because here I am teaching it to my 5-year-old son while we were on a picnic. He did a great job of it. If he can do it, you guys could do it too. So let's get at it. False. False is an unreachable state. You see false, you don't see anything else. There's no world, there's no nothing, okay? It means nothing. True means there is a reachable state, okay? So now you're starting to see there's something on the left-hand side. We're going to call that, properly speaking, that's a well-formed formula, okay? It's a WIF, but we're just going to call that the rule, okay? So the rule is over here, and then off on the right-hand side, there's going to be a model. And now we're going to look at diamond true. And this means that there exists a transition to the next world. If it's an existential quantifier for possible worlds. You may have picked that up earlier on. So if you write diamond true, what we mean is that there's a world and we can get to another world. Okay, if we write diamond false, this is not helpful, okay? Because it's always false. It's never satisfied, okay? You cannot go to a world that doesn't exist. Don't write that, okay? But what if you throw an action inside? What if you throw something inside that diamond? Okay, so this is known as modal mu calculus, and modality is built off the modal mu calculus, this idea of throwing an action inside. Here we have diamond walk true. And what is this saying? This model satisfies this rule. Why? Because we can take that arrow of walking to the next world. Now, of course, you have and. You could do and. So we have diamond walk, true, and diamond drive, true. We have 2 arrows. We could take either one. All right? Or you can also chain these. So we have diamond drive, diamond walk, true, right? So first you drive, then you walk, then you're there, right? Well, what about this, okay? Is a quick quiz. Is this rule satisfied by the model to the right? The model to the right has this extra arrow thingy saying you can fly. Yeah, it is. It's still satisfied. Even though that extra arrow is there, the rule is still good to go because you can drive and you can walk and then get there, okay? We're also going to allow multi-actions. So in a single transition, we're going to be able to do multiple things. You might want to do this because, atomically, you have single steps, okay? So when we want to do multi-actions, we're going to put a plus sign here. So here we have diamond plus walk plus drive, true. We walk and drive. Okay, quick quiz. Which of these satisfies the rule? The rule over here is diamond plus walk, true, and diamond plus walk plus drive, true. And the answer is they both satisfy, okay? Because even these are multi-actions, and that first one, the second one, you might think, oh, I also need to drive. Well, this rule at the top doesn't say that it's necessary. So we can also negate whether something should happen. So here we have plus walk, neg drive. So this is saying that there is a transition where I can walk, but I can't drive. And then we can also use things like not. So if we wanted to write a rule that says we can't fly there, we're going to write not, and then can plus fly, true, and boom. Okay. You see on the model, though, we have this neg fly. All right. So we're going to do a couple more of these little exercises. We're now going to learn about box. Okay, so box, the easiest way to learn about it is that what it's saying is that the rule only applies to paths that start with that box. So in this case, we see that it starts with, we have box plus homework, and then diamond plus play equals true. And here we have 2 models, okay? In the first model, we're going to start at the top and go down. We do our homework, and then we play, right? That clearly satisfies that. But what about the second model? Is that also going to satisfy it? Yeah, in fact it does, okay? And the reason why it does is because this box is a universal quantifier. And this universal quantifier, if there's no transition, it accepts it no matter what. And here's William of Ockham saying, I told you so. And you're like, what? And if we read this text, actually, that he wrote over 1,000 years ago, it says, a necessary proposition is called necessary not because it's always true, but because it is true if it exists and cannot be false. So, yeah, I'm sorry, Bill. Clearly, you were working on this a long time ago. And, yeah, this syntax may look a little bit funny, but, it is actually the work of thousands of years of people bike-shedding formalism. So now you might ask, well, how do we actually write something equivalent to must? Like if we want to say that you must do your homework, well, here's something that isn't useful. You can't do box plus action equals true. That doesn't work. And you also can't do neg action false. Well, if you do neg action false, at least we get rid of that one model, but we still don't get rid of this model where you absolutely do nothing. So how do we get rid of that? Well, you have to write 2 things. You write box neg action false and diamond plus action true. And if you can write both of those, then boom, homework becomes necessary. You must do your homework. In modality, we have some syntactic sugar to make this easy. So what we do is we do box, diamond, plus homework. All right, what's this? It says, congratulations on accepting your new job offer as a temporal modal logician from Socrates Must Die Corp. Your job starts immediately. Ensure that Socrates is mortal. Okay, so is this model of Socrates mortal? We need to write a rule expressing its mortality. Can anybody think about how we're going to write this? Well, it's pretty easy. We just write, it's just a simple model. You need to step forward, right? It's box, diamond, live, box, diamond, die, true. Boom. Okay, we're going to keep our job. What if time is finer grained in days? I mean, we don't know how many days Socrates is going to live. It's just going to be like this long chain of live. What are we going to do? I mean, we could do this. We could do this like copy pasta thing where we just like live and then like handle every single case for every amount of days he might live. But what we really wish we had some recursion, but nothing too strong because we want to keep our language decidable. So I'll introduce you to a new thing, a new operator called eventually. And eventually f ensures that f eventually occurs. So here we see this model where from the left-hand side, Socrates lives, and eventually he dies, and we express it as eventually box, diamond, die, true. Under the hood, this is using a least fixed point operator. I'd love to go into that, but not going to be able to do that today. Socrates wants us to use this model instead. Oh, that's pretty nice. It's got this little loopy thing, right? Like instead of having to write all those live things. Okay, great. And look, it still satisfies our rule. It still eventually dies. But wait, does anyone see the problem? Yeah, this model of Socrates, it can evade death. Why? Because it can keep on living. Live. And it's always going to tell you, oh, eventually I'm going to die. But, you know, that eventually is only checking finite traces. It's not looking at that infinite trace. So what do we need to do? Well, here's another operator, and it's called always f. And this ensures that f always occurs. Under the hood, it's using a greatest fixed point. I'm not going to teach you about that, but it's pretty simple. Always can live true. That's what Socrates is getting away with, right? He's found this way where he always just rides that loop. Well, let's spec out a way where he's ensured to die. Right now, we know he's going to live. But what if we add on this additional clause and we say, and not always diamond live true? Now we cut out that model. All right, congratulations. Great first day on the job. You killed it. But that's just scratching the surface of modality. I hope you like that. If you did, please join the Discord. We will teach you more of our lore. And you might have some practical ideas for how this might be used in the future. But you might also be asking, why now? Why is this important now? And there is no other paper that excites me about this space than this one right here. It's a paper about the robust cooperation in Prisoner's Dilemma. And it's, if you know about Prisoner's Dilemma in game theory, it's basically a payoff matrix where it makes it hard to coordinate, you know? One option is to defect, and it's always safer. But the other option, cooperate, even though it's best, it's only good if you both do it. So Prisoner's Dilemma is one of those basic units of game theory. And what that paper shows is that two programs, if you give two programs and they're going to play a repeated game of Prisoner's Dilemma, and they're allowed to send each other hints about their strategies in the form of modal logic properties, that is, behavioral commitments to each other, not full transparency about who they are, what they are, etc. If they can do that alone, then in one shot they can coordinate, perfectly coordinate. And this is perfect coordination between agents. And I think that's a very pressing use case right now. And you might be asking, okay, well, how would you do this? How would you build such a system? And well, we have a thing for that. It's a new paradigm called verifiable contracts. I don't have time to talk about that today, but another talk, another time.
All right. Any questions? All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.